At 0730 hours on July 24th, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Lawrence Daspit stood in the conning tower of the USS Tinosa. Looking through his periscope, he observed the 19,000-ton Japanese tanker Tonin Maru No. 3, lying motionless in the water about 2,000 yards away. He had already fired 2 torpedoes at the ship. He had already fired 14 Mark 14 torpedoes at the ship in his initial volley. The tanker was severely damaged, leaning to the starboard side and completely motionless. There were no escort ships anywhere around. The sea was still, and the morning sunlight reflected off the tanker's rust-marked hull. Daspit had all the time he needed. It was the ideal opportunity. A perfect kill, the sort that submarine captains fantasize about. A completely helpless target. No urgency, no danger, just a crippled vessel waiting to go under. He guided the Tinosa into an ideal firing setup, positioned at a right angle to the ship's beam, only 875 yards away, a distance so close. A loud clang reverberated through Tinosa's hull. The crew heard it distinctly, metal striking metal, but no detonation followed. Daspit launched another torpedo. It struck firmly again, producing the same sharp metallic impact. Still no explosion. He fired a third one. The outcome was identical. A fourth, then a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, an eighth, a ninth, a 10th, an 11th. Every torpedo traveled perfectly. Each one struck precisely where Daspit intended. The crew heard every impact of the submarine's hull. Clang, 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 like hammers pounding, as if hammers were smashing against an anvil. Yet not a single one detonated. The sailors in the torpedo room realized something was off. The fire control crew realized it too. Daspit also knew something was seriously wrong, but they continued launching torpedoes. Maybe the next one would function. It didn't. Daspit had begun this. He had entered the encounter with 16 torpedoes. His initial spread of 4 had resulted in 2 strikes that severely damaged the tanker. After that, he launched 11 more, firing them one by one from an ideal attack position. 11 perfect hits. 11 hollow metallic clanks ringing through the sub's hull. 11 complete duds. Every torpedo landed exactly on target, yet not a single one detonated. The tanker remained there, hurt but still floating, as if taunting them. Daspit now had only 1 torpedo remaining. He held on to that final fish. He ordered Tinosa to surface and set course for Pearl Harbor. He intended to return with proof that American submarines were being deployed into combat with weapons that failed to function. What Daspit didn't yet realize was that his disastrous attack would at last push the U.S. Navy to acknowledge what submarine crews had been shouting for nearly 21 months. The Mark 14 torpedo was fatally flawed at its core, and that faulty weapon was costing the lives of American submariners, while allowing Japanese vessels to move freely across the Pacific. This wasn't merely a mechanical issue. It was a disaster that had already claimed American lives and allowed thousands of Japanese ships that should have been sunk to remain afloat. But by late 1943, U.S. submariners would correct every flaw, a turnaround that came only after a heavy cost in lives. A major flaw in their torpedoes, often corrected despite resistance from the very engineers who built them. And once the submariners finally had reliable weapons, American subs would choke Japan's economy so thoroughly that the Japanese military would later admit that the U.S. submarine offensive was the biggest factor in their defeat. In contrast, Japanese submarines, though among the most advanced in the world, achieved virtually nothing. They possessed high-quality subs. They had torpedoes that actually worked. But their strategic decisions were so deeply flawed that their entire submarine force became meaningless to the outcome of the war. The first U.S. submarine captain to realize that something was dangerously wrong with the Mark 14 was Lieutenant Commander Tyrell Jacobs, commanding the USS Sargo. On December 24, in 1941, just 17 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Sargo launched 8 torpedoes at Japanese merchant vessels. Jacobs heard each one hit, metallic thuds ringing through Sargo sonar, but none of them detonated. The enemy ship steamed away without a scratch. Jacob submitted a thorough report, clearly stating that his torpedoes had struck their targets but did not explode. The Bureau of Ordnance examined his report and decided the fault lay with the crew. According to them, the torpedoes were functioning properly. Jacobs must have mishandled the attack preparation. This became the Bureau's routine answer for the next 18 months. Submarine captains reported torpedoes malfunctioning, and the Bureau of Ordnance routinely placed the blame on the commanders themselves. Lieutenant Commander Richard Vogue, in command of the USS Sailfish, launched 14 torpedoes at Japanese merchant vessels in January 1942. Through his periscope, he saw each torpedo pass beneath the ship's sterns or keels without detonating. He, too, reported that his torpedoes were traveling far too deep, at least 10 feet lower than the depth he had set. The Bureau of Ordnance replied that the torpedoes were operating at the proper depth. The issue, they said, had to be faulty attack angles or mistakes in fire control. Other submarine captains reported the same issues. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Parks, commanding the USS Pompon, attacked a Japanese freighter in January 1942. He launched 6 torpedoes from an ideal firing position. All 6 passed beneath the ship. The freighter escaped unharmed, without taking any damage. Parks reported that his torpedoes were running deeper than intended. The Bureau of Ordnance blamed his depth-setting methods. Lieutenant Commander James Coe, in command of USS Skipjack, attacked a Japanese aircraft carrier on Christmas Day in 1941, less than 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. He launched 4 torpedoes at close range. All for either ran off target or failed to detonate. Coe later wrote in his patrol report that Japanese anti-submarine defenses were so weak a submarine could practically chase their ships right into the bay, yet his torpedoes still couldn't sink them, any of them. By March 1942, submarine commanders across the Pacific were submitting the same kinds of reports. Torpedoes diving too deep. Torpedoes striking ships but failing to detonate. Torpedoes blowing up early before ever reaching their targets. The patterns were the same across multiple submarines, different crews, and various commanders. Yet the Bureau of Ordnance insisted that nothing was wrong with the Mark 14. The Bureau had created the weapon. The Bureau had tested it. According to Bureau, it was functioning correctly. The person who would eventually overcome this bureaucratic stonewall was Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood. In May 1942, Lockwood assumed command of submarines in the Southwest Pacific, based in Fremantle, Australia. He was 52 years old, a career submariner who had been in command of submarines since World War I. His men affectionately nicknamed him Uncle Charlie. He paid attention to his crews. And when submarine captains reported that their torpedoes were failing, Lockwood took their word seriously. Unlike many other admirals, he was different. His entire career had been spent in submarines. He understood the submarines. He understood the weapons. He knew what functioned properly and what didn't. Most importantly, he had confidence in his submarine commanders. When they reported torpedo malfunctions, Lockwood didn't think they were making excuses for mistakes. He believed they were being honest, and he was determined to prove them right. In June 1942, Lockwood took an action that broke every rule in the Navy's chain of command. Without approval from the Bureau of Ordnance and without official authorization, he pulled a submarine from combat duty to conduct his own torpedo experiments. He didn't seek permission, knowing it would be denied. He simply went ahead. He launched torpedoes set to specific depths through submerged fishing nets in Frenchman Bay, near Albany, Australia. Then he examined the holes the torpedoes made in the nets. The approach was straightforward but decisive. If a torpedo was set to run at 10 feet, but tore a hole at 21 feet, it meant the torpedo was running 11 feet too deep. The evidence was irrefutable. The Mark 14 torpedoes were running an average of 11 feet deeper than their set depth, occasionally as much as 15 feet too deep. Lockwood now had the proof. He submitted his test results to the Bureau of Ordnance along with a detailed report. The Bureau reviewed the data and rejected it. They claimed the tests were done incorrectly. The nets were supposedly set at the wrong depths. The submarine must have been improperly balanced. The torpedo's depth-setting mechanism must have been incorrectly calibrated. According to the Bureau, there was nothing wrong with the Mark 14 torpedo's design. The Bureau of Ordnance had created it. The Bureau had tested it at Newport. The Bureau declared it worked. Therefore, it must be working. Any evidence suggesting otherwise was considered faulty. The supposed issue was with the pressure of the depth control mechanism. Sensor. During development, when engineers added weight to warhead, they never readjusted the sensor. The added weight caused the torpedo to run deeper than intended. This was no small mistake. An 11-foot depth error meant that torpedoes aimed at a destroyer's keel would pass entirely beneath the destroyer without striking it. Torpedoes aimed at a merchant ship's waterline would similarly pass safely underneath. Once the issue was recognized, the solution was simple. Recalibrate the depth. Adjust the depth-setting mechanism to compensate for the heavier warhead. They relocated the pressure sensor to the torpedo's midsection, where water pressure could be measured more accurately. By the end of 1942, the depth issue was resolved. Yet submarine commanders continued to report malfunctions. Now, with the torpedoes finally striking their targets instead of passing beneath, a new problem became apparent. The torpedoes were hitting ships but failing to detonate. The Mark 14 used a Mark 6 exploder mechanism, which had two activation methods: a magnetic influence trigger, designed to sense a ship's magnetic field and set off the warhead under the keel, and a contact trigger meant to explode upon striking the hull directly. The magnetic trigger was advertised as groundbreaking technology. Explode under the keel, snap the ship's spine, and send it to the bottom with a single torpedo instead of needing 3 or 4. But the magnetic trigger was failing disastrously. Lieutenant Commander John Scott, commanding the USS Tunney, ended up in an ideal attack position on April 9, 1943. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were in. Scott was positioned directly ahead of him. He was only about 880 yards away, close enough for him to clearly spot the aircraft on the carrier decks through his periscope. He launched all 10 torpedoes, carefully targeting all 3 ships. He heard 7 detonations. For a moment, the crew believed they had made solid hits, but when Scott peered to the periscope and saw that all 3 carriers were still moving at full speed on their original course. Not one of them showed any sign of damage. The blast had gone off too early. Later, intelligence confirmed that all 7, the torpedoes had gone off before reaching their targets. The magnetic trigger sensed the carrier's magnetic fields too early and set off the warheads long before the torpedoes struck the hulls. These early explosions caused no harm to the blast only alerted the enemy that a submarine was in the vicinity and revealed its exact location. It was more dangerous than simply missing. A miss made no sound, but an early detonation informed every nearby destroyer precisely where to search. The issues with the magnetic trigger came in 3 main forms. First, Earth's magnetic field isn't the same everywhere. The Bureau had conducted its tests in the waters off Rhode Island, but the magnetic conditions in the Pacific were completely different. This caused the trigger to fire too soon or fail to activate entirely. Second, the magnetic trigger was extremely sensitive. Small changes in magnetic field intensity were enough to set it off early. Third, the exploder unit itself had structural issues. Seawater often seeped into the housing, rusting the electrical components, and the brush assemblies that delivered power to the system were also affected. The brush assemblies that powered the magnetic sensor were substandard and broke down during real combat situations. Lockwood pushed to disable the magnetic trigger right away, but he required approval from senior leadership. That approval finally came from Admiral Chester Nimitz on June 24, 1943. All submarines operating under Pacific Fleet Command were instructed to shut off the magnetic exploder and rely solely on the contact detonator. This eliminated the issue of early explosions, but it exposed a third major flaw. The contact trigger was malfunctioning. This became clear when Lawrence Daspit came across the Tonin Maru No. 3 on July 24, 1943, with the magnetic detonator turned off. His torpedoes were expected to explode the moment they struck the tanker's hull, but they didn't. 9 direct impacts, and all 9 failed to detonate. Daspit returned the Tinosa to Pearl Harbor carrying a single torpedo that had failed to detonate. He turned it over to the torpedo workshop on base for inspection. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood greeted Daspit at the submarine dock. Lockwood later recalled, "I fully anticipated a flood of curses aimed at me, the Bureau of Ordnance, the Newport torpedo facility, an entire torpedo shop at the base. I wouldn't have faulted him for it. You don't get chances at sinking a 19,000-ton tanker every day." I believe Dan was so angry he could barely speak. Lockwood demanded urgent testing. The Pearl Harbor torpedo facility began trials right away. They launched torpedoes against the submerged rock faces near Cohola Island. They also released practice warhead torpedoes from cranes onto metal plates set at various angles. The experiments exposed the issue. The firing pin assembly in the contact exploder was badly engineered. The firing pin itself was too heavy. When a torpedo struck a target straight on at a 90 degrees angle, when the torpedo hit the hull at a perfect 90-degree angle, the abrupt slowdown generated forces of more than 500 Gs. That impact pressure warped the firing pin before it could reach the percussion cap, causing it to seize inside its chamber. The warhead failed to explode. Ironically, the more accurate the strike, the higher the chances of malfunction. A shallow, angled impact might still trigger a detonation because the slowdown was less severe and occurred over a longer moment, but clean, straight-on hit at a right angle almost guaranteed failure. A direct, 90-degree strike, the very type submarine crews were taught to aim for, would lock up the firing pin and result in a dud. U.S. submarine tactics stressed achieving flawless right-angle hits from a target side. Unfortunately, that doctrine virtually ensured a maximum number of torpedo failures. The torpedo shop then took the weapons apart for inspection. They examined Daspit's unexploded torpedo and discovered the firing pin assembly in precisely the condition the tests had indicated. The pin was warped, the casing was deformed, and the whole mechanism had collapsed under the impact forces. Admiral Lockwood ordered instant in-the-field adjustments. The torpedo workshop at Pearl Harbor's torpedo shop engineered a redesigned firing pin that was both lighter and more durable. They produced the replacements using aluminum taken from the propellers of downed Japanese aircraft, an irony no one missed. By September 1943, every submarine departing from Pearl Harbor was equipped with the updated pins. Submarines were finally equipped with dependable torpedoes. By November 1943, all 3 critical flaws had been resolved. Depth settings were corrected, the magnetic exploder was disabled, and the contact detonator had been rebuilt. For the first time since the conflict began, U.S. subs could rely on their weapons. Torpedoes, 21 months after Pearl Harbor. 21 months of sending submarine crews into battle with faulty weapons. 21 months of enemy ships that should have been destroyed, continuing to sail unharmed. The person who forced these. The man responsible for implementing these fixes was Lockwood. He challenged the Bureau of Ordnance at every turn. When the Bureau declined to conduct tests, he carried out unauthorized trials himself. He recorded each torpedo malfunction in precise detail. He gathered patrol reports from dozens of submarine captains detailing torpedo failures. He compiled the data and found that U.S. submarines were firing 10 torpedoes for every ship actually sunk, a ratio that should have been closer to 3-1. At most, the fault lay with the torpedoes, not the submarine captains. Lockwood authorized his commanders to make their own torpedo modifications whenever official updates were postponed. Some submarines were even disabling the magnetic. Submarine commanders had modified their exploders on their own, breaking regulations because they knew the devices were faulty. Lockwood defended them. He didn't court-martial anyone for these unauthorized torpedo alterations. He shielded his crews from any punishment by the Bureau of Ordnance. In early 1943, Lockwood traveled to Washington to confront Bureau officials face-to-face. He entered a conference room filled with senior officers, several of whom had helped design the Mark 14 and were reluctant to acknowledge its defects. Lockwood presented his evidence, tests, results, patrol records, and compiled statistics. He demonstrated that the magnetic exploder was unreliable and that submarines were striking targets without sinking them. He insisted that corrective measures be taken. The Bureau officials became defensive, claiming that Lockwood submarine captains were not properly maintaining the torpedoes. They claimed the magnetic exploders were being ruined by careless handling. They suggested every possible cause except that the design itself could be defective. Lockwood finally lost his patience. He told them, if the Bureau of Ordnance can't supply us with torpedoes that actually strike and detonate, or with anything more powerful than a toy gun, then for heaven's sake, have the Bureau ships design a giant boat hook so we can tear the hull plates off a target ourselves. Sighed. The room fell completely silent. No one ever addressed the Bureau of Ordnance like that. But Lockwood wasn't worried about etiquette. He was worried about his submarine crews. He was sending sailors into combat with faulty weapons, and the officials responsible for designing those weapons seemed more focused on protecting their own reputations than fixing the problems. Errors instead of correcting them. Lockwood made it unmistakable that he wouldn't leave Washington until real action was taken. He had Admiral Nimitz backing him. He had solid proof, and he had no intention of giving up. Lockwood also took steps that withdraw. Lockwood did something equally crucial. He replaced submarine captains who lacked sufficient aggressiveness. During the first year of the war, many U.S. submarine commanders operated too cautiously, still following pre-war guidelines that encouraged minimal risk. They often launched a single attack, fired their torpedoes from a long distance, and then pulled back whether their shots had landed or not. This approach came straight from peacetime training manuals, but it didn't destroy enemy vessels. Lockwood pinpointed the bold, decisive skippers and advanced them. He assigned them the finest submarines and the strongest duties. Leaders such as Dudley Morton, Richard O'Kane, Samuel Dealey, and Eugene Fluckey became the figures who turned the U.S. submarine force into a legend. Morton, aboard the Wahoo, pioneered the method of placing his executive officer at the periscope during attacks, while he himself directed the entire engagement. This approach allowed Morton to absorb data from sonar, radar, lookouts, and the periscope operator all at the same time. It improved his tactical judgment because he wasn't locked onto a single source of information. Other submarine captains soon adopted this method. Samuel Dealey, commanding USS, Harder gained renown for going after destroyers rather than merchant vessels. Destroyers were high-risk targets, quick, well-armed, and equipped with depth charges. Most submarine captains steered clear of them. Harder sought them out on purpose. In May 1944, he sent 3 destroyers to the bottom in just 4 days. In June, Harder destroyed 2 additional destroyers within just 2 days. Dealey showed that bold submarine tactics could eliminate the very ships meant to track down submarines. Harder was ultimately lost with her entire crew in August 1944, but Dealey had already proven how far an aggressive approach could go. Leadership could achieve. Eugene Fluckey, captain of USS Barb, pushed boldness even further. In January 1945, Barb slipped into Namuan Harbor in China, struck a Japanese convoy sitting at anchor, and escaped while under fire. Then in July 1945, Barb carried out the only land-based raid by U.S. submarine crewmen in the entire Second World War, putting a small demolition party ashore on the Japanese mainland to destroy a railway line. Fluckey ended the war as a Medal of Honor recipient, along with 4 Navy, burdened by defective equipment. These bold skippers demonstrated that U.S. submarines were fully capable of controlling the Pacific once they had reliable torpedoes and were no longer held back by malfunctioning weapons, held back by overly timid tactics. Lockwood equipped them properly, granted them the latitude to fight aggressively, and then let them deliver victories. Lieutenant Commander Dudley Morton assumed command of USS Wahoo on December 31, 1942. Before starting his first patrol as captain, Morton addressed the crew. He announced that Wahoo was expendable. Anyone who preferred to stay behind in Brisbane had half an hour to ask for reassignment. No one would face any consequences for doing so. No one who stayed ashore would have been judged negatively, but not one sailor took the option. Every man chose to serve under Morton. His 3rd patrol in January 1943 became the stuff of legend. Morton steered Wahoo straight, into Wewak Harbor on New Guinea's northern coast. There were no maps of the area. There were no proper charts of the harbor. One crewman had picked up a low-quality atlas in Australia that depicted Wewak as just a tiny notch along the shoreline. Using that crude map as his reference, Morton guided Wahoo into hostile waters. Inside, he spotted a Japanese destroyer moored alongside several submarines. Morton launched 3 torpedoes at the destroyer from about 1,200 yards, but all of them either missed or failed to function properly. The destroyer detected Wahoo and swung around to attack. Through the periscope, Morton could clearly see the enemy vessel racing straight toward him at full speed. Under normal conditions, any commander would have dived deep to evade the attack. But Morton held his position. He let the destroyer come even closer. When it was so near that a collision seemed almost certain, Morton fired one more torpedo directly at it. The torpedo shot straight into the destroyer's path, striking it midsection and splitting it into 2. The ship went under within minutes. 2 days afterward, Wahoo came across a convoy of 5 vessels north of New Guinea. Japan imported huge amount of food and all the materials essential for war production. Oil from the East Indies, rubber from Malaya, iron ore from China and Manchuria, and food from Korea and Taiwan all had to be transported by sea. The merchant fleet was the lifeline of Japan's economy. American submarines severed that lifeline. By mid-1944, oil tankers were being sunk faster than Japan could replace them. Refineries began shutting down due to the shortage of crude oil. Without fuel, aircraft remained parked on airfields. Training flights halted, and combat missions steadily declined. Warships stayed anchored in harbor because there was no bunker fuel to power them. The massive battleship Yamato spent nearly all of 1944 moored at a dock, as Japan lacked the fuel oil needed to run it. When Yamato finally sailed on its one-way suicide mission to Okinawa in April 1945, it carried just enough fuel to reach the target. There wasn't sufficient fuel left in Japan for it to come back. Industrial output crumbled as well, since factories depended on a steady supply of raw materials. Ships that were supposed to be hauling iron ore, coal, bauxite, and copper now lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Aircraft production declined. Shipbuilding fell off. Ammunition output shrank. Japan's war economy was suffocating. Not because of air raids and not because of battlefield defeats, but because American submarines had wiped out the merchant fleet that sustained the entire system. After the war, Japan's cabinet stated that the destruction of their shipping was the main reason for their collapse. Not the atomic bombs, not the island campaigns, and not the strategic bombing, but the annihilation of their merchant marine. American submarines achieved this devastation, even though they made up less than 2% of the entire U.S. Navy. But the price paid was severe. During the war, 52 American submarines were lost, and 3,656 submariners were killed. That meant a 22% death rate, the highest proportional loss of any branch in the U.S. Armed Forces. 1 out of every 5 submarine sailors who set out to fight never returned. In contrast, the overall U.S. military fatality rate was around 3%. Submarine crews died at 7 times that rate. The casualties occurred all across the war. Some submarines vanished without any record, likely destroyed by mines or depth charges with no one left alive. Others were sunk in recognized engagements, going down while still battling the enemy. USS Grunion may have been sunk by one of its own faulty torpedoes that looped back. USS Tang was certainly lost to a torpedo it fired itself. USS Wahoo was tracked and destroyed in La Perouse Strait. Every submarine loss meant the deaths of roughly 60 to 80 crewmen. The submariners understood the danger. They chose submarine service, fully aware of the high death rates. They set out on patrols knowing they might never come home. They continued to fight despite malfunctioning torpedoes, heavy casualties, and the terrifying reality that their own weapons could doom them. And still they succeeded. They choked off Japan's economy, severed the supply routes that powered Japan's military, and achieved outcomes that shortened the war and spared hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese lives. The price was immense, yet the alternative, fighting the war without a strong submarine effort, would have been even more disastrous. At the same time, the Imperial Japanese Navy fielded what was arguably the most technologically sophisticated submarine fleet in the world. Japan constructed submarines far larger than anything the U.S. ever launched. The I-400 class subs displaced about 6,500 tons when submerged, housed 3 bomber aircraft in a SEAL hangar, and boasted an astonishing range of 37,000 miles. They could journey from Japan to the U.S. West Coast, strike targets, and sail back without ever refueling. Japan also built submarines capable of reaching 23 knots on the surface, faster than any American submarine at the time. Japan produced a wide range of submarines, manned torpedoes known as Kaiten, transport subs, and boats designed for scouting missions. By 1945, Japan had constructed all 39 of the world's diesel-electric submarines that generated more than 10,000 horsepower. They possessed advanced technology, high-quality vessels, skilled sailors, and torpedoes that functioned reliably from the start. Yet they achieved very little. Japanese submarines managed to sink only 2 American aircraft carriers in 1942. I-19 destroyed USS Wasp on September 15th, and that same spread of torpedoes also struck the battleship USS North Carolina, ripping a 32-foot gash in her side. I-168 sank USS Yorktown on June 7th, shortly after the Battle of Midway. These were major achievements, but they were isolated events rather than part of an effective, continuous campaign. Japanese submarines also damaged the battleship North Carolina and sank the cruiser USS Indianapolis in 1945. Yet their overall results were minimal. Throughout the entire war, Japanese subs sent only about 184 merchant vessels, totaling roughly 1 million gross tons, to the bottom. In contrast, German U-boats destroyed 2,840 ships, amounting to 14.3 million tons. American submarines sank 1,314 ships, totaling 5.3 million tons. Even British submarines, operating on a smaller scale, accounted for 493 ships of 1.52 million tons. Japanese submarines had the potential to achieve results equal to, or even greater than, those of other nations, but they fell short because their overall strategy was fundamentally flawed. Japanese naval thinking centered on the idea of one grand, decisive showdown, modeled after the 1905 Battle of Tsushima, where Japan crushed the Russian Baltic Fleet in a single encounter. Military planners assumed that any future conflict would unfold the same way: draw the U.S. Navy across the Pacific, wear it down with submarine attacks and air strikes during the approach, and then annihilate it in one gigantic surface engagement using battleships and aircraft carriers. Japanese submarines were built to serve that doctrine. Their main assignment was to locate U.S. naval groups, track them, and strike at warships, not at target merchant vessels. Tactically, this approach made some sense, but strategically it was a dead end. American fleet units were fast, agile, and heavily protected. To attack a U.S. carrier group, a Japanese submarine had to slip past destroyers armed with sonar and depth charges, avoid radar-equipped patrol aircraft, and then try to hit carriers capable of 30 knots and surrounded by multiple escorts. And even when Japanese submarines managed to score hits, the price they paid was often severe. A submarine had to close the distance, risk being detected, and then somehow slip away afterward. Many never made it out. Targeting merchant shipping would have yielded far greater results. These merchant vessels were slow, usually traveling only 10 to 12 knots. Their defenses were weak, and early in the war many sailed with no escorts at all. Yet they were vital to Allied supply networks. Every cargo ship carried essentials: fuel, rations, ammunition, machinery. Destroying them disrupted operations, delayed assaults, and forced the Allies to commit ships and aircraft to guard convoys. A full-scale offensive against American supply routes across the Pacific would have severely strained Allied protective forces. The distances involved were massive. It was 2,400 miles from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor, 4,700 miles from Pearl Harbor to Australia, and 5,000 miles from Pearl Harbor to Philippines. These supply routes were exposed and at risk. Japanese submarines, thanks to their long range and endurance, were ideally suited to disrupt those lines. But Japan's naval command never adapted. They continued ordering submarines to chase warships even as the overall situation grew worse. Then things deteriorated further. As Japan lost territory and isolated outposts began to starve, submarines were reassigned to transport duty. By 1943, many Japanese submarines were carrying food, ammunition, and supplies to cut off island garrisons. Torpedoes were taken out of the tubes. Weapons were removed to free up space. External cargo pods were even welded onto the hulls. Boats designed for combat turned into makeshift supply carriers, hauling rice and shells instead of stalking enemy ships. These resupply missions were practically suicidal. Submarines had to surface near island beaches under cover of darkness just to unload their cargo. They were exposed and sluggish on the surface, essentially helpless against air strikes. American planes and patrol craft pursued them without mercy. The losses were staggering. Many submarines were destroyed while hauling supplies, tasks that faster destroyers or purpose-built transport ships could have handled far better. But the Army insisted on using submarines, and the Navy yielded, sacrificing frontline boats on missions they were never meant to perform. Veteran crews and priceless submarines were squandered delivering a few tons of rice and ammunition to outposts that were destined to fall anyway. These resupply operations were effectively death runs. Submarines had to surface close to island shores at night to offload cargo, leaving them exposed and nearly motionless. In that state, they were easy prey. American aircraft and patrol boats hunted them relentlessly. The losses were horrific. Dozens of submarines were destroyed while carrying supplies. Jobs that fast destroyers or purpose-built transport subs could have handled far better. But the Army insisted on submarine assistance, and the Navy gave in, sending combat submarines on missions they were never meant to undertake. Captain Atsushi, a staff officer in Japan's Grand Escort Command, later wrote about the Navy's failures in anti-submarine warfare. He stated plainly that Japan's failure in ASW stemmed largely from the Navy's refusal to recognize how critical the issue was. He noted that Japan didn't even create a unified command structure to protect merchant shipping until November 1943. By then, the submarine campaign was already lost. Even after the Grand Escort Command was established, the resources available were far from sufficient. Japan focused on building destroyers meant for major fleet engagements, fast ships with heavy armament. They never produced low-cost, mass-manufactured escort destroyers suited for convoy protection. The U.S. and Britain, by contrast, built hundreds of dedicated escort vessels for anti-submarine operations. Japan never made that kind of commitment. Their anti-submarine doctrine was also flawed. Depth charges were initially set to explode at shallow depths. When U.S. Congressman Andrew May exposed this in 1943, Japanese forces adjusted to deeper settings. Yet even with the correct depth, their depth charges still lack effectiveness. Japanese destroyers were also behind in sonar and radar technology, making it much harder for them to locate submarines or maintain contact long enough to attack effectively. Japanese naval aviation also failed to develop successful anti-submarine tactics. American patrol planes sank dozens of Japanese submarines, while Japanese aircraft rarely managed to destroy American subs. There was a deeper cultural issue at play. The Japanese Navy emphasized offense over defense. Battleships and aircraft carriers carried prestige. Escort and protective duties did not. Anti-submarine warfare was viewed as a defensive, unglamorous task that offered little career advancement. The best officers and newest technology were assigned to strike forces, leaving convoy protection with whatever remained. This problem wasn't unique to Japan. Britain faced similar challenges in World War I and the early years of World War II. But Britain adapted, learning to build an effective convoy system. Japan never made that shift. By the middle of 1944, the situation for Japanese shipping had become catastrophic. Oil imports plunged from 1.8 million tons in 1943 to just 300,000 tons in 1944. Rice shipments from Korea and Taiwan fell by 70%, and iron ore from China dwindled to a mere trickle. Factories ground to a halt. Civilians faced severe hunger. The military struggled to move troops and supplies. American submarines were effectively choking Japan to death, while Japanese submarines were doing almost nothing to stop it. There was one notable instance where Japanese submarines caused major losses. On July 30th, 1945, USS Indianapolis was torpedoed and sunk by I-58, killing 879 sailors, most of them due to shark attacks and exposure during the 4 days before rescue. Indianapolis had just completed a mission delivering critical components for the atomic bomb to Tinian. The sinking was a tragedy, but by that stage of the war, the loss of a single cruiser had little strategic impact. Japan was already doomed, and the conflict ended just 2 weeks later. Admiral Charles Lockwood retired from the Navy in 1947 after 35 years of service, most of which had been spent in submarines. He authored several books on submarine warfare, including Sink 'em All, published in 1951. Lockwood championed the efforts of his submariners, making sure their achievements were properly acknowledged. He passed away on June 6, 1967, at the age of 77, and was laid to rest at Golden Gate National Cemetery in California, alongside Admirals Chester Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, and Richmond Kelly Turner. Lawrence Daspit, who had brought Tinosa home with a single torpedo after the Tonin Maru incident, continued to command submarines. He carried out 4 additional war patrols, sinking multiple Japanese vessels. Daspit survived the war, remained in the Navy, and retired as a Rear Admiral in 1962. He passed away in 1998 at the age of 87. The torpedo he preserved from the Tonin Maru attack proved crucial in exposing the contact trigger defect. That one torpedo gave Lockwood the evidence needed to compel the Bureau of Ordnance to fix the problem. Dudley Morton kept up his aggressive style. He completed 4 more patrols as well as commander, sinking ships on every mission. His 4th patrol, in March 1943, in the shallow waters of the Yellow Sea, became legendary. Over 10 days, Wahoo sank 7 ships and damaged an 8th. Morton's 5th patrol, which began in late April 1943, was just as successful. Over 10 days, he launched 10 torpedo attacks, sinking multiple ships despite ongoing torpedo malfunctions. His 7th patrol started on September 9, 1943, when Wahoo was ordered to enter the Sea of Japan via La Perouse Strait. The submarine was never heard from again. Japanese records later showed that Wahoo had been attacked by anti-submarine aircraft on October 11, 1943, in the strait, resulting in the loss of all 80 officers and crew. Morton was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. Wahoo earned 6 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation. By the end of the war, Morton had sunk 19 ships, totaling about 55,000 tons, making him one of the top 3 American submarine commanders. Richard O'Kane, Wahoo's executive officer under Morton, later commanded USS Tang, sinking 33 ships for 116,454 tons, the highest total for any U.S. submarine commander. Tang was ultimately lost when one of her own torpedoes ran in a circle on her final patrol. O'Kane survived the war, spending his remainder as a prisoner, and was awarded the Medal of Honor afterward. He passed away in 1994 at the age of 83. The lessons from the submarine campaign are clear. Technical superiority counts for little without sound strategy. In many respects, Japanese submarines outmatched their American counterparts. They were larger, faster, had greater range, and carried more torpedoes. Their weapons worked reliably from the start, yet they targeted the wrong objectives. Many subs were diverted to supply missions rather than combat, and they were never organized into a focused campaign against merchant shipping. Meanwhile, American submarines struggled with defective torpedoes for 21 months. Once the torpedoes were reliable, American submarines combined effective strategy, bold commanders, and an unyielding focus on crippling Japan's economy. The results were decisive. U.S. submarines sank 55% of Japanese shipping, while Japanese submarines achieved almost nothing of strategic significance. Another key lesson is institutional. The Bureau of Ordnance refused to acknowledge problems with the Mark 14 torpedo. They ignored reports from submarine commanders, blamed crews for failures, resisted proper testing, and delayed any corrections. It required a commander like Lockwood, willing to bypass the Bureau, carry out unauthorized trials, and challenge bureaucracy at every level, to get the torpedoes fixed. Had Lockwood been less determined, and accepted the Bureau's assurances that all was well, American submariners would have continued to fight the war with defective weapons. Casualty rates would have been even higher, and the strategic effect almost non-existent. Often, the most important victories come from addressing problems that everyone else refuses to acknowledge. That was the case in the Pacific Submarine War. American submariners knew their torpedoes were faulty, and Lockwood trusted their reports and fought to correct the issues. Once the torpedoes worked, nothing could stand in their way. In contrast, Japanese submarines had advanced technology and capable crews, but lacked the right strategy. This proves that technology and equipment alone do not win wars. Strategy and determination are what win wars. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us bring more forgotten World War II stories to light. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Every story counts. Every story deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Our community stretches across continents, bringing together people who understand that the lessons of history are still relevant today. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.